They had already gained the upper hand before even a single bomb was dropped, while Admiral Yamamoto's mighty fleet moved forward across the Pacific, certain that they were on their way to a great victory. Commander Joe Rochefort was far from the battle line. He sat hunched in a small, dimly lit basement beneath Pearl Harbor's intelligence center, surrounded by piles of intercepted Japanese radio traffic. His uniform was wrinkled from long hours, his face worn down, and his eyes bloodshot from working 18 hours a day. He was breaking down the Japanese Navy's most carefully hidden secrets, one symbol at a time, with an intensity that few men could sustain. The war had reached May of 1942, only 6 months after Pearl Harbor had been set ablaze. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, controlled at key points by enemy strongholds. Japanese warships patrolled the waters, and their flag now flew over Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, and vast parts of the ocean. Every battle since December 7th had gone in their favor, and to many Americans it seemed as if the war was slipping away. But inside this crowded basement room, known only as Station Hypo, something was quietly happening that would shift the entire course of the conflict. I was there, Ensign Tommy Mitchell, recently graduated from the Naval Academy. While most of my classmates were serving on destroyers or aircraft carriers, fighting with guns, torpedoes, and courage on the open sea, I had been assigned here as a junior intelligence analyst. My weapons were pencils, worksheets, and patience. Day after day, I worked to make sense of thousands of intercepted Japanese radio messages that streamed in from our receivers. It wasn't the kind of duty that looked heroic, but I would soon discover it was the most critical job in the Pacific. The man who commanded this strange and vital battlefield was Lieutenant Commander Rochefort. He was thin, sharpened, and had an uncanny ability to imagine how the enemy thought. While other officers appeared in perfectly pressed uniforms, shining shoes, and stiff discipline, Rochefort worked in a worn red smoking jacket, slippers on his feet, and a constant cigarette between his fingers. He smoked heavily as he pored over signals, muttering to himself, making connections that others missed. Rochefort had studied Japanese codes for years and knew their communication styles and patterns as if they were his own language. In many ways, he understood them better than some of their own officers. One morning in late May, he waved me over. "Mitchell," he called, his voice low but urgent, holding up a fresh decode. "Look at this. What do you make of it?" I took the sheet from him. The message was incomplete. Fragments of coded designations we had been following for weeks. But one stood out from the rest AF. We had noticed it appearing again and again, always linked to talk of major operations. Now it was clear that AF meant something important, and the Japanese were gathering their biggest forces for whatever it was. "It looks like a major target, sir," I said after studying it carefully. "They're talking about carriers, battleships, and invasion forces. This isn't small. This is massive." Rochefort gave me a grim nod. "Exactly. The question is, where is AF? If we can find that out, we might be able to stop them." This question had been argued for weeks. Many in Navy intelligence, especially those in Washington, believed AF referred to somewhere in the South Pacific. Some argued it was in the Aleutian Islands. Others even suggested the west coast of the United States. But Rochefort had a very different idea, one that seemed too daring to believe. "I think AF is Midway," he said, stubbing out his cigarette in the ashtray. "Every traffic analysis, every mention of distance and timing, everything points. There they want Midway, and they're going to use their whole carrier fleet to take it." If Rochefort was right, we had stumbled upon the intelligence find of the century. The Japanese were planning to attack Midway Atoll, a small dot of land over 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. But more than that, they were going to use the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. If we could predict their move and set an ambush, it could change the war. But if Rochefort was wrong, Admiral Nimitz would commit our already thin forces to the wrong location, leaving the true target undefended. The consequences could be disastrous. "We have to be absolutely certain," Rochefort said firmly. 100% sure. Because if we are wrong, this entire war could be lost. That was when he revealed a bold plan to settle the matter once and for all. It was risky, it went against rules, and it could have backfired, but it was clever. "We're going to make Midway speak," he told the team. The idea was straightforward. Send out a message from Midway, claiming that their water purification system had broken down. It would be sent using normal Navy channels, which we knew the Japanese were listening to. If they intercepted the message and reported a water shortage at AF, then we would have undeniable proof. The message was sent. All we could do now was wait. Within a day, Japanese signals confirmed it. Our operators picked up an enemy transmission reporting that AF was experiencing water supply problems. The deception had worked perfectly. AF was Midway. Rochefort allowed himself a rare smile as he looked around at us. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "we've just won the Battle of Midway. Now we need to make sure Admiral Nimitz understands exactly what we have." Admiral Chester Nimitz read Rochefort's intelligence report with the full concentration of a man who knew the fate of the Pacific rested on his decisions. The report contained everything: Japanese battle plans, ship assignments, timing, and objectives. It was so detailed it seemed almost impossible. Nimitz studied the figures carefully. "They're throwing everything they have," he said, going over the order of battle. 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 21 submarines. He compared it to what we had: only 3 carriers and a small number of cruisers. The imbalance was staggering, but intelligence had given us one priceless advantage. We knew where they were coming, and when. That single fact changed everything. For the first time, the Japanese would be walking into an ambush rather than setting one. They believed they were hunting us, but in truth, it would be the other way around. I was in the intelligence center when the call came from Nimitz's office. "Send Rochefort up immediately," the admiral's aide said, "and bring everything you've got on the Japanese plan." Minutes later, Rochefort climbed the stairs, still dressed in his red smoking jacket, carrying a heavy folder stuffed with decoded messages, notes, and analyzes. He was ushered into the admiral's office, where he spread out the evidence. For the next 2 hours, he explained in detail every piece of information we had gathered about Operation Mitha, Japanese plan to capture Midway and crush what remained of our fleet. Rochefort explained that the Japanese expected the Americans to react the same way they had at the Coral Sea. Yamamoto was placing his main force 300 miles northwest of Midway, hoping our carriers would rush in to defend the attack, only to be ambushed. But Rochefort pointed to another spot on the map, northeast of Midway, and explained that if the U.S. carriers were placed there instead, they could strike first and catch the enemy by surprise. Admiral Nimitz studied the charts carefully, his weathered face giving away nothing. The decision he was about to make carried enormous weight. If Rochefort's information was correct, the U.S. could cripple the Japanese Navy in one blow. If it was wrong, the last 3 American carriers would steam straight into a trap and be lost. The admiral finally asked the question that mattered most. "How certain are you about this?" Rochefort answered without hesitation. "Completely certain. Admiral, they'll come at Midway on June 4th from the northwest with 4 carriers, leading. If we're in position, we can strike them at dawn." Nimitz was silent for a long time, thinking through the risks. Then he nodded and made his choice. "Very well. We'll put Task Force 16 and Task Force 17 here," he said, pointing at the spot Rochefort had recommended. He added a warning. "But understand, Commander, if you're wrong, there won't be a Pacific fleet left to defend Hawaii." Rochefort met his eyes and replied simply, "I understand, sir, but I am not wrong." As he left, I could see the immense weight pressing down on him. In only 3 days, everything we had worked for would either succeed or collapse. Either we would spring the greatest trap ever set at sea, or we would give the Japanese their greatest triumph. The following 2 days blurred together in frantic activity. Admiral Halsey's Task Force 16, built around the carrier's Enterprise, and Hornet, was recalled quickly from the South Pacific. Task Force 17, under Admiral Fletcher, was centered on the carrier Yorktown, which had limped back from Coral Sea, battered and full of holes. Repairs that should have taken months were done in just 3 days, with shipyard crews working night and day to make her seaworthy. By June 2nd, all 3 carriers were steaming toward the position Rochefort had chosen. They carried every dive bomber, torpedo plane, and fighter the Navy could gather. It wasn't enough to match Japan's numbers, but it was enough if surprise worked in our favor. In the intelligence center, we continued to follow the Japanese fleet as best we could. Their carriers were silent, but their supply ships and submarines still transmitted, giving us steady clues. Rochefort reported to Nimitz on June 3rd with confidence. "They're right on schedule. Their carriers should be northwest of Midway. By dawn tomorrow, our forces are exactly where they need to be." That night, I could hardly sleep. Somewhere in the darkness, the strongest naval force in the world was closing in on Midway. In only hours, we would discover whether months of code-breaking had truly paid off, or whether the Pacific Fleet was about to be destroyed. The morning of June 4th, 1942, broke calm and clear over the ocean. At 5:45 a.m., a Navy patrol plane, a PBY Catalina, flying west of Midway, sighted the Japanese carriers. The pilot's voice came over the radio, tense but steady. "Enemy carriers, bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles from Midway." Many planes headed toward the island. At Pearl Harbor's intelligence center, the message arrived and filled us with a mix of excitement and fear. It was happening exactly as Rochefort had predicted. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were launching their first wave against Midway, completely unaware that 3 American carriers were waiting to strike. Rochefort's voice was tight with emotion as he said, "This is it. Everything we've worked for depends on these next hours." Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers had already launched 108 planes against Midway's defenses, bombers and fighters, but on their decks remained a second strike group, loaded with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to attack ships once the American fleet was located. Those planes were fueled and armed, waiting for orders. Nagumo believed he had the initiative, but he didn't know that the Americans had already positioned themselves perfectly. At 6 a.m., aboard Enterprise, Admiral Spruance made the choice that would alter the course of the war. Although the Japanese carriers were at the very edge of his plane's range, he ordered a full strike. Every available bomber, torpedo plane, and fighter was launched. It was a dangerous gamble. The planes would have just enough fuel to reach the target and return if they didn't get delayed. But if they could catch the Japanese carriers while their decks were crowded with fueled aircraft, the damage could be catastrophic. From Pearl Harbor, all we could do was listen to the radio, reports and mark positions on our maps. The American strike force 67 dive bombers, 29 torpedo planes, and 20 fighters was heading toward the enemy. Meanwhile, Japanese planes were hammering Midway's defenses as their carriers prepared to launch again. The hours that followed were excruciating. Every transmission was tracked. Every silence felt unbearable. The first American planes to find the Japanese carriers were the torpedo squadrons from Hornet and Enterprise. Their attack ended in disaster. The old Devastator torpedo bombers were slow and unprotected, easy targets for the Japanese Zero fighters. One after another, they were cut down by machine gun fire or torn apart by anti-aircraft shells. Of 41 torpedo planes, only 6 made it back. Not a single torpedo struck home. But their sacrifice had an unexpected result. In defending against the torpedo runs, the Japanese fighters were pulled down to sea level, leaving the skies above their carriers wide open. At 10:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise arrived overhead. From their cockpits, the pilots saw the Japanese carriers laid out below in a box formation. McCluskey gave the order, and the planes rolled into their dives. Over the radio came the urgent voices of the flyers. "I see them. 4 carriers in sight. Going in on the nearest one." The American dive bombers came hurtling down out of the sky, targeting the Japanese carriers with precision. Their bombs smashed into the flight decks, which were crowded. With planes fully armed and fueled, ready for launch, in only minutes, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were turned into blazing infernos. Their decks torn apart, their aircraft destroyed, and their crews struggling desperately to survive. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's squadron from Yorktown then found the 4th carrier, Hiryu, and scored deadly hits. By 10:30 in the morning, 3 of Japan's carriers were nothing but burning wrecks, their power shattered. Inside the intelligence center, we followed the pilots' reports with disbelief. All those long hours of code breaking, every intercepted signal, every pattern we had tracked it, had worked exactly as hoped. The strike force that had ruled the Pacific for 6 months was being wiped out in just a few minutes. Rochefort whispered under his breath, hardly believing it himself. "My God, we've actually done it." But the fight wasn't finished yet. Hiryu, the one carrier still intact, had survived the morning attacks and immediately launched a counterstrike just before noon. Her dive bombers located Yorktown and scored 3 direct hits, crippling the ship. 2 hours later, torpedo planes from Hiryu attacked again, leaving Yorktown dead in the water. For a brief moment, the Japanese believed they had evened the score. But the tide turned once more. At 5 in the evening, dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu and struck with the same ferocity that had destroyed her sister ships. By nightfall, all 4 of the carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were ablaze and doomed. Admiral Yamamoto, watching from his flagship hundreds of miles to the west, saw his carefully designed plan collapse into disaster. For half a year, Japan's advantage in intelligence and naval aviation had brought them victory after victory. Now, that advantage was gone. The Americans had not only matched him but outmaneuvered him, and the very heart of his fleet had been destroyed. By night, as grim reports of losses poured in, Yamamoto gave the order that sealed the outcome. The invasion of Midway was canceled. His surviving ships were told to withdraw. Japan's expansion across the Pacific had ended. Over the following days, the scale of the defeat became undeniable. 4 fleet carriers had been sunk, along with nearly 250 aircraft and most of Japan's most skilled naval aviators. These were men who had trained for years, men who had been considered the best in the world, and now they were gone. Japan had lost more in one day than it could hope to rebuild in 2 years. American losses were painful, but far smaller. Yorktown was finished off by a Japanese submarine, and we lost 145 planes with their crews. But Enterprise and Hornet remained intact, and many of our downed pilots had been rescued. Most importantly, the battle shattered the image of Japanese invincibility. For months, they had seemed unstoppable. Every fight had ended in American retreat, and their navy had looked untouchable. But Midway proved otherwise. They could be beaten, and beaten badly. The victory was shared by many of the pilots who risked their lives diving through fire, the sailors who fought to save their ships, the commanders who made bold choices at critical moments. But at its core, it began in the basement of Pearl Harbor, where a handful of cryptographers cracked the enemy's codes and exposed their plans. As Rochefort later said, "We gave Admiral Nimitz the gift of knowing beforehand. We told him where the enemy would be, when they'd arrive, and what they intended to do. That is the greatest advantage any commander can have." Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War. From that moment on, Japan would never advance again. Never again would they catch the Americans off guard. The men at Station Hypo had given the Navy the power of foresight, and the Navy had used it with devastating success. Yet the triumph carried a heavy cost. The Japanese garrison at Midway fought with the courage of men who knew they were trapped, and the American pilots who struck the Japanese carriers flew at the very edge of their range, many knowing that if they were shot down, survival was unlikely. On both sides, sailors and flyers showed the kind of bravery that can only come in the crucible of battle. In the weeks after, as more Japanese communications were decoded, the picture became clearer. Reports of destroyed carriers, frantic calls for rescue, and desperate attempts to salvage ships told the full story of their defeat. At one point, I handed Rochefort a message from Admiral Nagumo to headquarters, admitting that all 4 carriers were gone and asking permission to retreat. Rochefort read it slowly, his expression a mix of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. 6 months ago, they caught us asleep at Pearl Harbor, he said. Today, we gave it back to them. The difference is, this time we were ready. The implications were massive. Japan's dream of building a vast defensive ring across the Pacific was gone. They no longer had the carriers to project their power over such distances. From Midway onward, they would fight not to expand, but to hold on to what they had left. And perhaps most importantly, their aura of invincibility was broken forever. Still, even as we celebrated, there was no illusion that the war was finished. We had won a great victory, but Japan would adapt. Just as we had learned from Pearl Harbor, they would change their codes, revise their tactics, and search for new ways to fight. Midway was the turning point, but it was not the end. The intelligence edge that had allowed the Americans to win at Midway was never going to last forever. The Japanese would adapt, and the only way to stay ahead was to keep breaking their codes and continue uncovering their secrets. Even now, writing about those times so many decades later, the memory of that basement room at Pearl Harbor is still clear. The heavy smell of cigarette smoke mixed with coffee, the constant noise of typewriters, and the crackling sound of radio static. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his small group of cryptographers had accomplished something that changed the direction of the war. Yet their achievement was hidden from the world. The aviators who struck the Japanese carriers became celebrated. Heroes, their pictures appearing in newspapers and magazines. Admirals who organized the battle were awarded medals and higher ranks. But the Codebreakers remained unseen. Their part of the story, locked away, classified, and unrecognized for years. It wasn't until decades later that the full role of Station Hypo came to light. Rochefort himself paid a price for what he had done. Bureaucrats in Washington, bitter that he had proven them wrong and unwilling to share the credit, forced him into an unimportant desk assignment. The man whose work had been central to the victory at Midway was sidelined by officers who had contributed little to the actual war effort. It was an unfair and embarrassing moment in naval leadership. Yet the legacy of Station Hypo endured. The methods Rochefort and his team developed became the basis for American intelligence efforts across the rest of the war. The ability to read Japanese signals gave U.S. commanders the advantage again and again. From the Solomon Islands to the Philippines to Okinawa, every major American success in the Pacific was strengthened by intercepted and decoded messages. Midway proved that battles are not won only by bravery, or by bigger fleets, or even by superior weapons. True success came from intelligence, from planning, and from being able to think faster and more clearly than the enemy. The Japanese had some of the best trained pilots in the world, highly skilled crews, and the most powerful carrier fleet in the Pacific. But they lost because they underestimated American intelligence and failed to keep their own communications secure. After Midway, warfare only leaned even more heavily on intelligence. Today, satellites and advanced computers have replaced intercepted radio codes and manual decoding. But the core idea remains unchanged. The side that knows the enemy's plans has the upper hand. The men of Station Hypo understood this truth. To them, every broken code, every translated transmission was not just information but a weapon that could save American lives and bring the war closer to ending. They pushed themselves relentlessly, often working 18 hours a day without pause, fully aware that their work was the difference between life and death. Rochefort often remarked that Midway was won not on the decks of the carriers but inside the intelligence center, and he was right. Everything that followed the positioning of the fleet, the carefully timed airstrikes, the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers was possible because Rochefort's team confirmed that the target, known as AF, was Midway itself. The Japanese tried to recover from their defeat by changing their codes, tightening their communication systems, and being far more cautious in their planning. But what they had truly lost at Midway could not be regained. The most skilled pilots and crews, men who had trained for years and proven their abilities in earlier battles, were gone forever. Their replacements, rushed through training, could not match their experience. Just as damaging was the psychological blow. For months, the Japanese Navy had believed itself unstoppable. Their pilots and commanders had been taught that spiritual will, and dedication would triumph over any disadvantage in numbers or resources. The loss at Midway shattered that confidence. From then on, their power began to weaken. For the United States, Midway was proof that the war could be won. The grim months after Pearl Harbor, when Japanese forces had seemed to dominate everywhere, were finally past. America's industry, its technology, and now its intelligence had shown that Japan could be beaten. What remained was the long campaign. To put that potential into action, looking back, it is striking how much depended on just a handful of men in a basement office. If Rochefort had made a mistake, if the Japanese had changed their codes earlier, if even one of countless small factors had gone differently, Midway might have been a disaster for America instead of a turning point. But intelligence work is always uncertain, built on fragments of information, careful guesses, and the courage to act on them. Rochefort and his team made the right decisions at the right moment. They broke the code, revealed the enemy's plan, and gave Admiral Nimitz the knowledge needed to prepare the perfect trap. Japanese carriers burned not only because American pilots fought bravely, but because American codebreakers had unlocked the enemy's secrets. In the end, the outcome of Midway, their most decisive naval battle in history, was determined not by superior firepower, not by unmatched tactics, not even by sheer courage, but by better intelligence. The side that uncovered the enemy's secrets was the side that shaped the course of the war. That lesson has not faded with time. In today's world of global communications and instant information, the side that can uncover the enemy's secrets, while protecting its own, still holds the greatest advantage. The men of Station Hypo proved this truth, and their legacy continues in every intelligence victory that followed, every broken code, and every secret revealed in the service of freedom. Looking back, it becomes clear that victory at Midway was not only the story of daring pilots or powerful ships, but also the story of men working silently in a dark basement, far from the noise of bombs and guns. Their names were not shouted in the headlines, yet their work changed history. They showed that true strength in war comes not only from courage in battle, but from the patience, intelligence, and determination to uncover the enemy's secrets. The Codebreakers of Station Hypo prove that knowledge itself can be a weapon, and their legacy reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are won long before the first shot is fired. Asterisk.